I'm outside the offices of the BBC's Persian service in central London. I've come here to investigate repeated allegations of bias against the broadcaster made by senior officials in both Tehran and Whitehall. But these have nothing to do with the launch of the new BBC TV channel being broadcast into Iran. My focus today is on papers I've come across which raise doubts about the role of the BBC in the late 1970s, when Iran was teetering on the brink of revolution.
This is London.
The portrait of Khomeini is being prominently displayed right in front of the Golden Gate.
In his latest public statement, Ayatollah Khomeini refers to the Shah as a professional criminal. Exactly what it says, that the Shah must abdicate or be deposed.
Letters written by the Iranian ambassador to the British Foreign Office alleged that a biased BBC was acting as the mouthpiece of Ayatollah Khomeini, backing the downfall of the Shah.
We are frankly astonished at the undisguised bias that is an ever-present feature of its broadcasts. And the compromise is nothing but the subversion of Iran's legally constituted government and the systematic encouragement of violence, sedition and bloodshed.
The Iranian ambassador during those heady days was Parvez Raji.
The BBC had become an instrument for the dissemination of the views of a man whose avowed objective was to take the country back to 7th century Arabia. However they worded it, it was coming across loud and clear as the voice of opposition to the Shah. The BBC had to be shut up.
And how was that going to be done?
The embassy in London was instructed to follow very closely every single utterance of the BBC Persian services and to object constantly to instances of biased reporting.
Hardly had the ink dried on the signature of my letter to you yesterday when yet another egregious example of the journalistic style which characterises the Persian service lay.
So determined was the ambassador to shut up the BBC's Persian service that he came up with a somewhat extreme plan.
I rang up my foreign minister one evening and I reminded him that the BBC had 2 booster stations on the coast of Oman and they could sneak in one night, blow up these booster stations, and of course this would give us a respite during which the BBC would be quiet.
How much damage do you think all this did to the Shah's chances of survival?
Well, the $64 question is that if you're asking me, would the Iranian Revolution have happened without the Persian language of the BBC, the answer is definitely yes. Did the BBC Persian language fan the flames? Yes.
Some of the more outlandish claims even suggested that the corporation was airing lessons on how to make petrol bombs, claims that were never substantiated. I might already have dismissed allegations of BBC bias as equally risible, were it not for another document that has come to light. Only just released under the 30-year rule, it's a confidential memo written in September 1978 by the British ambassador to Tehran, Anthony Parsons. In it, he says that the Iranian government claimed to have evidence that anti-Shah protests on the streets increased immediately after BBC broadcasts.
There's been a major battle going on here for the last half hour.
Parsons went on to make clear that he was becoming increasingly anxious given Britain's significant trade with Iran in the oil and aerospace industries.
The only effective move that I can think of would be for a confidential approach at ministerial level to be made to the Director General of the BBC to convince him that the Persian language broadcasts are threatening our interests here.
Parsons then goes even further by suggesting that the BBC should replace its correspondent in Tehran, Andrew Whitley.
To counterbalance the unsympathetic attitude hitherto reflected by Whitley, which, I cannot help feeling, strikes a ready chord amongst some of those concerned at Bush House. He is very inexperienced as a journalist, and he unfortunately fell, when he arrived last year, unduly under the influence of a particularly anti-Shah group of foreign journalists. The Persian service undoubtedly reflects his approach.
Sadly, the ambassador who wrote that surprisingly personal attack died more than a decade ago. But I'm hoping to track down the subject of his wrath, Andrew Whitley. I'm told he's long since left the BBC, though is still definitely alive, as is the man who received Ambassador Parsons' angry memos, the then British Foreign Secretary David, now Lord Owen.
He was pretty fed up with the BBC, and he felt that more should have been done to curb some of the broadcasting. You had a respected ambassador who people liked personally and thought was effective, definitely coming out strongly in support of something being done, and you knew that it was against his liberal instincts, so you had to take it seriously.
Did Britain at the time of the Shah want democracy then, want the Shah to go?
Well, we didn't want the Shah to go, but I think no ifs or buts about it. We didn't particularly like what the Shah was doing, but we thought the alternative was worse, and I personally believe that the revolution and what happened in the immediate aftermath of the revolution demonstrated the truth of that belief.
With Britain clearly convinced that the growing threat to the Shah was endangering British interests, David Owen wrote a letter to the chairman of the BBC, Sir Michael Swan, stressing,
"It is obviously more essential than ever to be certain that the highest standard of objective reporting is upheld."
Despite British backing for the Shah, it was widely known at the time that he ran a repressive regime. Professor Ali Ansari is from the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of St Andrews.
What the Shah was doing by the 1970s is he'd instituted a one-party state. He'd taken on an enormous amount of power unto his own self. He'd basically ignored the constitution, and there were undoubtedly excesses by the regime, including torture. Essentially, people began to live under the impression that they were in a security state of some sort, of police state. And that was really what they rebelled against by the end of the 1970s.
It was quite simply the biggest demonstration ever staged in Iran.
As the cycle of protests gathered pace, the authorities didn't have the non-violent means to contain riots. He didn't have any sort of riot police, for instance. So the only way that they could keep crowds at bay and rioters at bay was actually to shoot them.
Gunmen were everywhere. For more than 2 hours, we ducked behind buildings and watched as a fierce gun battle raged.
This is, of course, what led to this cycle, this degenerating cycle of protests in cities in the country, which basically gathered momentum. By late summer, it was quite apparent that the whole Pahlavi edifice was unravelling.
And as the edifice of that Pahlavi dynasty crumbled, it was the BBC that Iranians turned to for news. Iranian national TV and radio were dismissed by many as the mere mouthpiece of the Shah. In contrast, the BBC's Persian service was both widely respected and easy to hear thanks to its broadcasts on medium wave. It was, without doubt, the most important of the foreign news organisations broadcasting into Iran. But that fact only heightened the concern of those who believed the service was biased against the Shah. I've just come across this article in the Daily Telegraph, published in December 1978. Written by MP Julian Amery, it claims that young radicals have
achieved an effective penetration of the Iranian service of the BBC.
So, was the BBC's Persian service stuffed full of anti-Shah exiles? And, if so, did their views affect the BBC's much-prized editorial independence? Bakar Moin went on to be head of the BBC Persian service, but back then he was a programme assistant.
Most, not all, were not pro-Shah, or if anything, they were against the censorship, against the restrictions that were in the country. It was a common issue, especially among the Iranian students and the Iranian community.
Can I just ask about yourself, though? Your father was a cleric. Did you have sympathies with the Ayatollah at that time?
I wasn't in favour of the Shah, but I never really campaigned. I never was politically active in any sense of the word. I mean, the BBC was really very careful not to have anybody active in politics to be participating in the programmes of the Persian service.
But in your heart, were you pro-revolution?
I was pro-revolution, yes, like everyone else in the country by then. However, it didn't really affect the way the programs went out because we're under great scrutiny by everybody inside the BBC and outside the BBC to see what we are saying.
My research at the BBC's written archives in Caversham confirms the sheer volume of criticism that was being directed at the corporation. I've seen worried letters from major companies like British Aerospace, as well as one from Margaret Thatcher's parliamentary private secretary, soon after the then opposition leader visited Iran.
It is hardly necessary to stress the political consequences which could follow if reports continue which are judged to be biased and inaccurate in their presentation.
The target of much of this correspondence was Mark Dodd, who, as head of the BBC's Eastern Service, was responsible for Persian language programmes.
There was pretty intense pressure, and of course he came from many quarters, and British businessmen, very often backed up by politicians, felt that the BBC should not do anything to disturb the commercial possibilities in Iran.
Can I read you a document here? This is from the Foreign Office. One almost gets the impression that the overseas services are after, and I'm quoting there, the Shah. Were they?
Of course not. We don't. The BBC of those days, certainly, and I'm sure it's the case now, don't have private vendettas about people to whom they talk throughout the world. Part of it may have arisen because of the Shah's own deep-seated belief that the BBC was after him. And I do think that is quite a strong element in the way Iranians tended to confuse and conflate the fact that something had happened, therefore it must mean that the messenger was involved in being responsible in some way. The expectation to treat things professionally was so strong and so pervasive, I don't think we did anything other than what was proper at the time or could have done.
Subsequent inquiries involving both the BBC and the Foreign Office found no evidence of anti-Shah bias in broadcasts by the Persian Service or any other sector of the BBC. However, aside from the allegations of bias, there's the claim that the BBC was not simply reporting the news, but, wittingly or unwittingly, helping to shape it. An example of this, according to some from the time, was an interview one of its reporters carried out in Paris with the then exiled religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini. It was to be the only radio interview with the Ayatollah to be broadcast inside Iran by the BBC during those volatile days of late 1978. The impact was marked. Dr. Abbas Milani, who's now Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford University, was then an active opponent of the Shah.
It was the first time that Khomeini was heard on a wide basis. During that time, the only way to hear Khomeini himself was to get one of these underground tapes. This time, it was Khomeini in an interview, and it was Khomeini on BBC. I can't imagine that there was anyone involved in the political movement who did not either hear of the interview or hear the interview itself. There was nothing that afforded that character more legitimacy, more national and international authority than being interviewed by BBC in the manner that that interview was done. When Khomeini was put on the BBC and the tone of the interview was polite, the talk of the street was that this now puts the final seal of approval on Khomeini as the leader, and it finally indicates that Britain has broken with the Shah. The Shah is a goner.
So revolution was on the way.
The revolution was definitely on the way, and the future king had already been crowned by Her Majesty's MI6.
So, was this BBC interview planned as the coronation it turned out to be? Well, I've managed to track down the man who conducted it, David Perman. He insists that far from anointing a king in waiting, Many of his colleagues hadn't even heard of him.
We all know it was an important interview now with hindsight. At the time, I don't think many people in the BBC knew what an Ayatollah was. I remember people in the BBC club would say, "What's an Ayatollah?" And who's this man? How do you pronounce Khomeini? Is it Khomeini or Khomeini? There was quite a level of ignorance. We weren't then assuming that he would be in power. What we were looking for was the possibility of a democratic Iran.
He's established himself in a small village 20 miles from Paris, in a modest little house. There, surrounded
We'd
by
gathered in the
activist
courtyard
followers.
outside with his entourage and all these students, and seemed very friendly and very welcoming and very pleased that the BBC was taking an interest. And then they showed us into this room, and we sat cross-legged on the floor. Then he came in and sat down, squatted, about 2 feet away. Didn't look at us at all. A face of granite, no emotion whatsoever. No eye contact at all. Just this voice. Areas of questioning were agreed in advance with the Ayatollah's people. The first question was about Islam, and I then assumed that there was no place for the religious minorities, and so I asked a question about the minorities. The Ayatollah then answered it, and then turned to his people, and they all said to me, "That must stop. If you ask another question which is not on the script, we will stop this interview." And I said, "But there is no script." They said, "Yes, there is. It's been agreed. It's a script." And so I continued with it and took it back. It was up to people who knew much more about the situation in Iran and BBC policy. It was up to them to decide whether the interview should be broadcast.
When you came back with your interview, it seemed to go down well, didn't it? Certainly from the paperwork I have here, Mark Dodd, head of the Eastern Service, said the questions were intended not to give the Ayatollah an opportunity for propaganda, but to reveal the reality of his political views. Given the restrictions on that interview, could it ever do that? Did it do that?
Well, Mark is quite correct, and this was the intention. This was our intention.
But not the result.
The result was different. The Ayatollah did use it as a platform for his own views. That's quite true. And that was surprising, and that was not our intention to give him such a platform. To that extent, it wasn't a good interview. I wasn't able to press him with supplementary questions. We had to take what he gave us. On the other hand, it was a good interview in the sense that it did show what we were facing.
David Perman admits the BBC had been in the dark about what the Ayatollah represented. But Dr. Abbas Malani insists that if the BBC was unaware of the true power and policies of Khomeini, ignorance was no excuse.
Khomeini had basically in his books said everything he was going to do. But he decided that when he is going to be in Paris, he made a very conscious decision to look and talk as if he is a Gandhi-like liberal, which was no clergy is going to have any role. There will be freedom. There won't be any coercion. Women won't be forced to wear hijab.
So the BBC should have read his books.
Well, I would think that a good journalist in those days would have obviously read these books, but it wasn't only the BBC that hadn't done this homework. Almost none of them asked questions based on Khomeini's writings.
The BBC mattered more, though, because, unlike most other foreign news organisations, it was broadcasting into Iran. But given that Khomeini did his best to conceal his real plans, is it really fair to blame the BBC for failing to draw attention to the perils he posed? Or, to put it another way, that the corporation was the victim of manipulation rather than the perpetrator of it? Professor Ali Ansari is having none of it.
It would have been odd for the BBC not to have interviewed Ayatollah Khomeini. It would have been odd if they were a news-gathering agency. But at the same time, I think we have to bear in mind that clearly there are certain responsibilities need to be borne in mind when you're running a news organisation. I mean, I think they didn't take it seriously, what Khomeini represented. But, if you ask me, was that irresponsible? Yes, it was. I think people need to accept that they made mistakes about this and they interpreted things wrongly and they didn't want to see things. They just did not want to see things.
Mark Dodd says he wasn't involved in setting the editorial parameters of the interview. That was done by others within the World Service. But as the head of the Eastern Service, how did he feel about the fact supplementary questions weren't allowed?
I think it's an unsatisfactory basis on which to conduct an interview, and I always have thought so. You could argue that the man himself was the story. What you could get out of him was going to illuminate the character of the man. I think you can make a case for an interview of that kind, but I think it's flawed. Of course, our coverage was not as full as we would have wished, and there were undoubtedly gaps. So I'm not for a moment saying that this was an impeccable service. There were occasions when we made mistakes. I am still sorry that we made those mistakes. They were infinitely less than our critics suggested.
I've now managed to track down the former BBC correspondent who was the target of that withering attack from the British ambassador Anthony Parsons. Andrew Whitley was the BBC's man in Tehran as revolutionary fervour swept the city.
And they're taking over the streets.
Whitley still vividly remembers the reaction to the BBC interview with Khomeini in November 1978.
Almost everyone in the country was talking about it, talking about what he had to say, the fact that he was being given this airtime. People would stop each other in the streets, in the bazaars. People would say, "Did you hear? He's finally been allowed to talk." It had a huge impact.
Whitley may have seen himself as a neutral observer, but street-fighting opponents of the Shah clearly saw him as the man to ring.
I can recall going into a bazaar in the streets of one of the southern Iranian cities and seeing scrawled up in graffiti on the wall, "If you have any news, call this number," and it's my home phone telephone number.
The army seem to have come out now in force.
So, given his trusted status with opponents of the Shah and his relative inexperience as a foreign correspondent, does Whitley accept that he may indeed have been biased, as suggested by the British ambassador?
I think that Tony Parsons was unfair in saying that I'd fallen under the influence of a particularly negative group of journalists. In fact, the reverse was the case, was that the foreign journalists who were visiting the country would come to talk to me about what was going on, because I was one of the few who actually spoke some Farsi and knew the country reasonably well. Tony Parsons himself, in retrospect, admitted that he was wrong and I was right.
But these were heady days, weren't they? If you have your hand on your heart, would you say now, looking back, that you did in fact have a lot of sympathy yourself with those opposed to the Shah?
Yes, I would say that they had justice on their side. I personally believed that change was overdue in Iran, but I certainly would not say that I was advocating either for a leftist revolution or for the overthrow of the Shah.
But does he accept the allegation that the corporation did, at the very least, fan the flames of the revolution?
I wouldn't use those words to say fan the flames of the revolution, but the BBC did play a role. And it was something that was uncomfortable for BBC management to admit openly. They didn't at the time. But yes, I would agree that the BBC made a difference. If it wasn't for the BBC's broadcasts into the countries and its huge listenership, I think that the revolution might not have proceeded as quickly as it did.
Do you think that's a role that the BBC should be playing?
No, I don't think that the BBC should go that far. I think that the BBC ought to be careful about overstepping the line between reporting and being seen as part and parcel of the opposition movement. I don't believe that the BBC ought to, as a foreign broadcasting organisation, ought to be in a position of attempting to change domestic events. But I wouldn't put intent on our side.
"30 years later, BBC broadcasts are still being heard in Iran. And, just as before, its new Persian TV service has been accused of bias by the government in Tehran. But Behruz Afag, who's in charge of the service, says such allegations are completely unfounded.
Programs are reviewed constantly, regularly, are translated back, other people, other colleagues, everybody is watching, listening. These are the ways in which you make sure that the programs are objective, are impartial, are accurate, do reflect all the various kind of views. Quality and standards of journalism and interviewing has improved over these years, and also the prevalence of so many different media outlets means that very few media organizations have got that really powerful position of reporting something on their own. And I would say, I think it's become even more entrenched as modern values. Try and detach yourself from your own personal views and you report it as it is.
Despite the numerous allegations, I found no evidence of any actual bias in the BBC's reporting of the revolution and events leading up to it. But some do seem to believe that the BBC could have been both more rigorous and dispassionate in its coverage of events. And Andrew Whitley evidently feels that he and other colleagues in the BBC did allow themselves to be swept up by the fervent clamour for change. Yet when that change came, it took a form they never predicted.
Certainly the way that the revolution turned out was a disaster for many people in Iran, and I have personal regrets over that, having been a minor actor in that particular drama. Friends of mine died. Iranians were tortured who I knew. I have vivid memories of going into the morgues in Tehran after the nightly executions from the revolutionary court set up after Khomeini had taken power. Those haunt one for a long time.